and I've proposed to give a presentation on shared services and outsourcing, the challenge for the public and private sectors. And it gives me a chance to get a few things off my chest. So I'll get on with it now. The challenge for public and private sectors. I'm just going to make a comment, actually, because the slides normally show me as former director of the North West Centre of Excellence, which you think, well, what the heck has he done since then? And I did retire when the Centre of Excellences came to an end. It's a planned retirement. They were actually extended by a year. So I sort of delayed my retirement for a year. Then I went up Mount Kilimanjaro on my retirement, and that was my retirement present. And for any of you who haven't been up there, that's what it looks like from the top. You've still got some ice fields, and you do pass by glaciers like that, so it's pretty spectacular. So anyone who's thinking of going up there, just go. But make sure that you take your time so you acclimatise. Right, and since then I've been gradually picking up more and more work and keep myself extremely busy. But what I want to talk about is some challenges, really, and I want to issue challenges to the public sector and to implement the same efficiencies and shared services operations that outsourcings have to make. And I think we heard this morning from Clive that we ought to be able to implement the efficiencies in the public sector, but very often we don't. And we will often outsource the problem and leave it to someone else to make the efficiencies, but then we pay a profit margin, perhaps unnecessarily. And then there's to the outsourcing industry a challenge, and to social enterprises, to actually produce a proper vision and model for how public services should be delivered. And I haven't yet seen a coherent model from the private sector or from social enterprises as to how they think that public services should be delivered. And I'd really like to see that. And then another challenge to the outsourcing industry, and we do have some outsourcing organisations here, to actually operate a public sector and public service ethos, which is sometimes lacking. And finally, to the public sector outsourcing industry and social enterprises, to work up a common and more cost-effective approach to outsourcing the shared services and the use of social enterprises. And I think we can do things more efficiently. I think there are opportunities to do that. So what do we mean by shared services? The word is a very loose term. It can range from just benchmarking, comparing information, copying better practice. And nothing wrong with that. That's a very good way of moving forward. Or collaboration and consortia. And collaboration has been talked about a lot in the last few years. Or actual joint service delivery, maybe creating a joint enterprise. And service centres serving a lot of organisations and outsourcing to a common provider or a private sector social enterprise. And it's worth remembering that a lot of outsourced providers make money by actually providing a joint service to a whole range of customers so they can make use of the efficiencies that a shared service operation, a single service centre can provide. Public sector could do that, but so often we choose not to. And the benefits of the shared services, and yeah, you should be able to see that slide because there's a lot of potential benefits of shared services, and I'm putting this slide up just to remind people, and I'm not going to read through them all, but I think one of the key things to me is actually that we can end up with full accountability and transparency. And I can talk about this with some authority because I've actually one of the few people that's actually created a number of shared services operations which are still running. And I was doing that decades before anyone ever mentioned the term shared services. People just used to get on with it. And then suddenly we started to introduce the term shared services as if it was something novel. But it's not. It's happened in the public sector for years. It's being introduced into central government now. Nearly all the central government operations were shared services up to the early 1980s. And then they were broken up. Procurement, estates management was owned by one organisation, the estate. ICT was done by one organisation on behalf of central government. So in central government, shared services is nothing new. And therefore it ought not, in theory, to be too difficult to create shared services again. But there's no reason why it should be for local government, the NHS, and so on. And there's just a lot of benefits, and not all models will give you all of these benefits, but nevertheless they're worth bearing in mind. And I've put them up because you get copies of these slides on the public service website, and you'll be able to actually just remind yourself of the options and consider which models might give you the best benefits. And here's a few more benefits that you can get from shared services. One shared services operation I set up, I actually cut the staff costs by 15% in year one, but we also had a bigger workload. How did I cut the staff costs? It was actually by cutting out collaboration. It was moving from a collaborative model to a joint model. And collaborative costs tend to be very high, and people ignore that. So there are potential, and we introduced a whole range of methods of improving accountability by understanding costs, understanding service level, agreeing service levels, and agreeing what the budget would be, and a whole range of things like that. So accountability and transparency are some of the things that you can get with shared services operations, because you need a service level agreement that very often we don't have at the moment. I use this example from the Northwest. It may be a few years old, but it illustrates perhaps why shared services can sometimes work. On the cost of waste collection per household in Northwest local authorities, 2005-06, we did a bit of work to find out. And we found that the figures varied between about £27 per household up to about £66 per household. Very big variation. It doesn't mean to say that all those at the high end were necessarily doing things badly, because there are different circumstances. But once you've got this data, you can actually start to ask the right questions and say, well, possibly some of the organisations with a very low cost base, could their best practice be transferred to the organisations with a high cost base, or maybe should some of the organisations with the low cost base start to take over the work of the high cost operations? One thing that if you're able to see all the names at the bottom, you'd realise there was virtually no correlation between cost and type of authority. Which I thought was extremely interesting. So that's worth bearing in mind. And there are quite a lot of other examples that one can actually give. So what can the benefit be of shared services? Well, these are figures from my own experience, my own career. On an IT, it can be 5 to 80%. Well, where's the 80%? The 80% actually, I guess, is on procurement, and it can be licenses, because each local authority tends to pay for a lot of IT licenses, but they all pay them separately. Whereas if you actually look at the cost structure of the companies that provide the IT licenses, the whole group of authorities got together, the IT companies might try and change the cost structure, but you still get a massive saving out of it. And one therefore needs sometimes to look at the industry and see how the industry's cost structures operate to try and get the benefits. But also you can say by reducing the number of finance systems, not in local government, but actually in another part of the public sector. I came across one organisation that was putting in a finance system. It was going to cost £5 million. I said, why do you need it when you could actually use the one in the organisation next door, not quite literally next door? I was given all sorts of excuses, but the main reason was the finance director was worried that if they didn't have their own decent independent finance system and used one next door, someone might say, why do we need 2 finance directors? Why not have one? So I said, well, why don't you pay this bloke a couple of £1 million, give him a couple of £1 million payoff, you'll save £3 million straight away. That was a helpful suggestion, that wasn't it? Are there any finance directors near, by the way? Oh, you're right, okay, I've only upset one person so far. But you've got those things, even social care. 5%, 10%. Construction management. Construction is a real area where there are some quite big savings that could be made, and I could talk about that for quite a long time. Huge variations in practice I discovered, certainly in local government, but other parts of the public sector, and in capability. Some organisations quite brilliant at managing construction, and others really haven't remotely got it together, either the resources or the capability. And the results show. They may not show up front, but they show in the end result. And revenues and benefits. There's a classic example in Tameside. I'll be blunt. Islington Council set up a revenues and benefits site in Tameside in Greater Manchester, and they didn't tell Tameside Council. Anyone from Islington here? Nope, that's good. Tameside wondered why its staff were disappearing. They were disappearing to the Islington site in Tameside because Islington were paying more than Tameside Council. Had Islington approached Tameside in the first place, they'd have got a cheaper service and a good one, and save the cost of having to set it up. And it's examples like that that tell you that significant savings can be made. And with outsourcing companies, they will often reduce the cost by 30 or 40% in all sorts of ways. And they need to do that in order to be able to save you money and to make a profit. And occasionally they cut the costs a bit too much, and then your service starts to suffer. So one needs to actually have a realistic approach to benefits assessment, and to look at various approaches. What do you actually want to achieve? If you want to achieve savings and you want to achieve them quickly, what's the model you need to achieve? So in the short term, you might go for something like very simple like benchmarking, because that can deliver quick savings, benchmarking, and applying those benchmark lessons to other organisations, and Paul is giving me the 10 minutes up thing. Had you noticed the system we've got for keeping speakers on time? So Paul is getting his own back on me before I have a chance to get my own back on him. And there are various models that one can use, and one of the approaches I find very useful in just maybe making a quick assessment of the way we want to go is to list the objectives down one side and to list how far you think one thinks a particular model can deliver those objectives, really on a scale of, say, 0 to 5, something like that. And that's a first-pass approach, and it's worth bearing in mind that if you want quick savings, you might start off with benchmarking, but think in the longer term you want to move to outsourcing, social enterprise, or a joint service delivery. And this is one approach that can be quite useful.